everyone. This is Hua. Welcome back. I'm so happy you're here with me. Today I'm going to be reading a story I wrote a while back, and honestly, I haven't done much with it, so I decided I was going to share it with you, and I hope that you enjoy it.
Running through the crowd on a busy street. Need to find some air in the summer heat. So how about the music, like a whisper from the sea, and a little slow dancing with me.
Stacey Lee sat in the corner of the funeral room and watched as everyone who had known her father came to pay their respects. Men in black suits with tall hats and women in fancy black dresses, drenched in pearls, shed tears as they came to her father's coffin. She was feeling empty. She'd been crying for days now, and it seemed as if the tears kept refilling. She was exhausted, beyond dead tired, and still people kept telling her things would be all right. Like hell they would be. She'd lost the only person who meant anything to her. She would now have to pick up her life again, like she did after her divorce. Speaking of her divorce, her ex-husband, Jake Chang, walked into view with a bouquet of white roses. When their eyes met, he walked toward her. It wasn't that she hated Jake. A part of her still loved him fiercely, but it was because he didn't know that the meaning of I do meant you kept your pants zipped except for your wife. So she was an idiot for marrying him when she did. So he cheated on her and stole half of her inheritance when they divorced. So he hated her father and never really respected the man. But she had to give him credit for showing up today. Honestly, she thought he wouldn't. He'd proved her wrong. She met Jake in high school when he made the quarterback star. She was a young girl who was trying to find out who she was. In high school, she didn't have the hips she did now or the chest. But when Jake found her to be attractive, she fell head over heels. They were glued together even though her best friend Brandon had warned her of his type. She'd ignored him and eloped with Jake after high school graduation. When Jake got an offer with the firm he was with now, they packed and left behind the life she knew in southwest Minnesota and headed to the big cities with Jake. A few years later, her mother died, and her father moved to live with them. That was when the problems started. Actually, the problems were already there. Her father moving in just proved she'd been trying to hide them. Jake hated her father living with them and stayed out of the house. Pretty soon, they were sleeping in separate beds, and after that, he came home smelling like a woman. It was a downfall from there, and the best thing since she tied the knot 12 years ago was when she signed her divorce papers. I'm sorry for your loss, Jake said when he reached her. Jake's voice brought her back to the present, and she stood up. He was still handsome as ever. Silvering hair had dusted his temples, and he had aged well. Those bright blue eyes were always her favorite to look into, and he looked great in his black suit. But the ringless finger tugged at her heart, and she pushed their history aside as she took the roses he handed her. Thank you, she replied. He bent down and pressed his lips to her cheek. Really, Stacey, I'm truly sorry. Tears filled her eyes, and she let out a deep breath. When he reached for her, she pulled back and shook her head. He got the picture and nodded as he walked to the coffin. She stared at the roses and realized he'd gotten her father's favorite. Her father, Earl Lee, loved white roses and often had them planted around her house, but the house that she had lived in now was in Jake's possession. He got it in the divorce, and she ended up with a beat-up Chevy. She felt the tears slip down her cheeks, and to any onlooker, it looked as if she was weeping for the loss of her father. But inside, she was tearing up because the man she'd loved all her heart had turned cold. She set the roses on the chair and walked to the restroom, right up to the sink where she turned on the faucet. She ran her hands under the warm water and took a deep breath. As she splashed water on her face, she heard one of the stalls open behind her. Stacey reached for a paper towel and dabbed her face when she looked in the mirror and saw the woman standing behind her. It was Gloria, Jake's girlfriend, dressed in a sleek black dress that showed more cleavage than needed. Her blonde hair was streaked with brown strands and she wore deep red lipstick. You look tired, honey, she said as she walked to the sink to wash her hands. Stacy tossed the paper to the wastebasket and straightened up her spine. Gloria Yang was known around for sleeping with married men. She found them to be a challenge and she destroyed numerous marriages. Stacy's was the latest one. She swallowed down the urge to strangle the woman. And you look like a whore, Stacy said. Gloria's smile faded as she turned the water off. I'm the one who has your husband, honey. I can look any way I want. What are you doing here? This isn't a bar. Gloria gasped as if she just realized where she was. Oh, really? There goes my plan of getting another guy's phone number. Pain escalated through Stacy, and she slapped the woman across the face. Surprised, Gloria turned to face her, but Stacy pushed her against the wall. Gloria, I want you to listen real well to me. Perhaps other women may cry and be a mess when it comes to losing their men to you, but not me, okay? You chose the wrong woman to mess with. Gloria shoved her off and fixed her dress. You can say whatever you wish to say to me, Stacy, but I am the one he comes home to. You're just a divorcee from his past. Stacy smiled and walked to her. I'd rather be a divorcee than a whore. The smile on Gloria's face faded as Stacy turned and walked out. She passed a few people who were trying to give their condolences, but she ignored them and pressed forward until she saw Jake. He saw her face and walked toward her, taking her arm and pulling her outside to the parking lot. They waited until a couple walked in before Stacy turned toward him and shoved him hard in the chest. Why did you bring her here? This is my father's funeral, not an open bar, Stacy yelled. Jake threw up his hands. She's with me, okay? Wherever I go, she goes. I don't care if you don't like it, and if you have a problem with it, it's your own fault. Smiling, she replied, My fault. Right. It's always been my fault. Was it my fault you couldn't keep your damn pants zipped? Think about it, Jake. You shouldn't have brought her here. He walked to her and pointed a finger at her. Fine. I'm not even supposed to be here either. She watched as Gloria came out, and he took her arm, literally dragging her toward his car. When the car sped out of sight, she fell to the ground and started to cry. Her heart was pounding with anger and hurt as she stared at the band she wore on her hand. With shaking fingers, she took it off and tossed it on the ground. Wiping her eyes, she stood up and walked back inside, where she was met with a crowd of people who were feeling sorry for her.
Tell me a lie. I wanna love and I want it now. Fake it away. Say it loud, I could believe somehow we could be friends.
It took everything she had to drive away from the house she'd called home for the past 12 years without crying. After the burial of her father, she knew she had to escape from this place. Her mother's sister, Bia, was living in Marshall, where she'd grown up. She had polio and had lost the use of her legs. When her life had crumbled, she called Bia and asked for help. Without a single thought, Bia told her to pack up and head straight home. Now, with her Chevy jammed full of what used to be her life, she pulled her car to the driveway of the white Victorian house. She saw her Aunt Bia in her wheelchair on the front porch knitting. Aunt Bia looked just like her mother, but younger. They grew up close and lost both parents at a young age. For as long as Stacy could remember, Bia had been taken care of by her mother. When her mother died, Bia had been left to fend for herself. In the darkest of her times, Stacy often wondered how her aunt did it. Her aunt had short brown curly hair and dark green eyes that glowed like a cat's. She was in her early 50s and wore floor skirts and pressed white blouses. She never let her handicap stop her, and that was what Stacy loved about her. Aunt Bia had never married, and it always had Stacy wondering why. Stacy got out of her car, and Bia looked up when she slammed her car door. A smile spread across the older woman's face, and she put her knitting down. Stacy already felt the tears fill her eyes as she walked up the steps. Once she reached her aunt, she knelt down and hugged her tightly. Hey, baby girl. You're finally home, Bia said in a soft tone. Crying, Stacy pulled back and took a deep breath. I have nowhere to go. Bia reached over and wiped her eyes. I'm sorry I couldn't attend your father's funeral. It's okay, Aunt Bia. You're all I have left in this world. You must be hungry driving all this way. Bring your things in and we'll talk. Stacy pushed the door to the guest room aside and brought in her luggage. The bed was a simple twin bed with white covers with little pink daisies. She smiled at the print of the sheets and it brought warmth to her heart. Stacy's mother used to use sheets similar on her bed while growing up. She walked to open the window to let in some air. She changed from her jeans and shirt into a yellow summer cotton dress. It was hotter here than it was in the cities. Pulling her long hair into a bun, she walked down the stairs to find Aunt Bea in the kitchen. Smiling, she walked to the cabinets to gather some plates for lunch. The long road trip must have tired you out, she said as Stacy set the plates down on the table. I'm okay. She wheeled herself over. I made some lemonade earlier. It's chilling in the fridge. Go grab us some. Stacy opened up the fridge, took out the lemonade, and closed the door just as she brought it over. The front door opened and the voice of a young girl boomed in loudly. Hello, Aunt Bea. Are you home? Bea smiled. Hello, darling. Yes, I am. Stacy turned as a little girl about 6 years old walked in holding a basket of fresh raspberries. She was wearing a pair of white shorts and a pink top with her hair in two pigtails. She was so sweet looking with her eyes and dirt and smeared face. She smiled at Stacy and then caught Bea's gaze, and her eyes brightened. She rushed over and threw an arm around Bea. I brought you some fresh fruits. My father says it's the best, she said. Bea beamed. Thank you. I want you to meet someone. This is my niece, Stacy. This is Lizzie. She's my neighbor's daughter. Stacy smiled and knelt down before her. Hello, Lizzie. How are you? She smiled and picked out a raspberry for Stacy. Hello. You're pretty. Stacy took it. Thank you. You're pretty too. She smiled and then gave Bea another hug before she bolted out the door yelling goodbye. Laughing, Stacy stood and finished setting the table. As she sat down, Bea looked at her strangely and Stacy laughed. What is it? Bea brought her hands in front of her plate and pushed it aside. You don't recognize her? Stacy thought long and hard. Should I? She's Brandon's daughter. She gasped, and it finally hit her why she was so sweet and innocent. She had her father's smile. Stacy laughed as she leaned back in her chair. Really? She's so pretty. I didn't know Brandon was married. He's not. He never married. Her throat went dry. How'd he get a daughter, then? Bea sighed, and her shoulders hung. You should really go ask him for the story. Around here, it changes when told from one person to the next. Only he knows the truth. But I'll tell you this. He was torn up when you up and left to marry Jake. You know he was in love with you. Stacy laughed as she helped herself to some sandwiches. Brandon and I were best friends. He wasn't in love with me. I mean, we fished and hiked together. We were like buddies. Bea smiled and poured herself a cup of lemonade. He was your best friend, and yet you didn't know him at all. He had been trying to work up the courage to tell you he was in love with you. Don't you know why he kept trying to tell you that Jake was all wrong for you? Smiling, Stacy replied, Well, he was my best friend. Of course he'd think that. Wasn't he there to protect me? That too. But he also tried to keep you away from Jake. The two of you were like two peas in a pod. I don't think I have a single memory of you growing up without Brandon in it. Why didn't you marry him? She shrugged her shoulders. You have to be in love to get married, Aunt Bea. I wasn't in love with him. I mean, I loved him, of course, but, like, he was a big brother to me. He was there to protect me when I needed it. We were like fun buddies. Are you trying to convince me or yourself? Stacy's hand stopped in midair with a sandwich. She turned her eyes to look at her aunt, who was smiling. Slowly, she set a sandwich down and sighed deeply, the thought of food gone from her mind. Aunt Bea, Brandon and I were and always will be good friends. There's nothing beyond that.
I used to stay up all night trying to find my place, chasing neon lights and looking for some kind of trace to lead me out of darkness, give me a little faith, something to make me stronger, someone who could light the way. Then you came to me and you gave me reason.
The afternoon sun was now high in the sky as Stacy walked outside to take a look at the yard. She thought about putting up a garden here and knew that her aunt would appreciate it. There was a clothesline and she almost laughed as she thought about how she'd gone from hanging clothes out to dry to use an electric machine to do the deed. Aunt Bea's house was an old white Victorian house with 4 bedrooms and 3 bathrooms. The garage was detached and stood behind the house. The house was laid out in a rich Victorian design that Aunt Bea took advantage of in decorating it to her taste. There wasn't anything brand new, everything was bought from the thrift store. The yard needed some work, and she intended to cut the grass. Walking to the garage, she pushed open the door and walked in, meeting a cloud of dust and cobwebs. She pushed aside some boxes and found a lawnmower, except it wasn't a motorized one. She pushed away some cans and reached for the handle, but it was stuck, and she tried yanking it hard. A few boxes fell over, and some items fell out in a loud clank. Ah, great, Stacy whispered. As she reached for the fallen items, a pair of hands grabbed her around the waist and she shrieked. She tried to fight whoever was dragging her outside, but this person was strong. Let me go, she cried. She kicked and connected with his shin. He groaned out pain and let her loose. She turned around and found he was bending over in pain. She used her elbow and slammed it down in the middle of his back. He howled and she turned to go when he reached out and grabbed her leg. She toppled over and grabbed onto his shoulders, and they fell down together with him landing on top of her, their lips inches apart. Stacy stared into a pair of brown eyes that haunted her dreams and held her deepest secrets, a face that was a memory in her mind through time and again. She paused, and his name froze on her lips. What are you two doing out there? Bea's voice boomed from the front porch. Stacy gasped and turned to find her aunt wheeling herself to look at them. She pushed him off and stood as he also got up, brushing the grass from her dress. Blushing, she ignored his gaze as she turned around toward the front porch when he grabbed her arm, spinning her around. Stacy? He asked. She smiled and peeled his hand off of her. Brandon, it's been a long time. He laughed and ran a hand through his dark hair. I I'm sorry. I thought you were breaking into Bea's garage. She laughed. Oh, well that explains a lot. Stacy, Bea called from the front porch. Everything's okay, Aunt Bea. Okay, I'll be inside. Stacy turned back to find Brandon staring at her. She saw that gone from him was the long hair he sported in high school. His hair was much shorter now, and it suited him better. His eyes were the same dark ones that had stared into hers when they were together. He had filled out in his shoulders and arms. The jeans he wore hugged his legs and made them long and lean. The black t-shirt he had on broadened his shoulders even more. He was a man now, and a father. I met your daughter, Stacy said. He smiled, and his eyes brightened at the mention of her. You did? She's a handful, but I love her. I can see that. How are you? Stacy sighed and shrugged her shoulders. I'm okay. I heard about your father. I'm sorry. She lowered her eyes. Thank you. And Jake, too. Looking up, Stacy managed to smile. Thanks. Brandon reached out and took her arm. Come here. Trying to shrug off his arm, Stacy stepped away, but he caught her hand. He brought her closer to him, and she inhaled his scent. It had changed since high school. It was musky and very masculine. She looked away when he stared into her eyes. Since when did you try to be brave? I know you better than anyone, Stacy. You're hurting, and it's okay, Brandon whispered. Stacy looked up. Her eyes slowly filled with tears, and she turned away. I'm here, Brandon. Doesn't that say a lot about who I am? You came back home. There's nothing wrong with that. When things get tough, you just come back where you belong. It's a long written rule. Where does it say that? I thought it was that you were supposed to make it yourself even if you wanted to come back home. No one forced me to leave. I did the leaving myself. I thought he was the one to keep me happy, but after years of marriage, I realized that all I followed was a dream. Do you know how painful that is? Yes, I do. Turning around, Stacy watched as he stared at her with those eyes that knew her so well. She inhaled a deep breath. He wasn't the person she knew in high school. He was innocent back then. Today he stood a father, a scorned man from her wrongdoing, and yet he was willing to speak to her as if she had never heard him. She ran a hand through her hair and realized her hand shook. He must have noticed it too because he took her hand and held it. Just holding her made her feel stronger. and she realized that she missed him. She missed the moments they shared, the laughter that used to roar between them, and the memories they created together. Leaving him had created a hole inside her heart, and it took this long to realize that no one had been able to fill it, not even Jake. I should get going, she said suddenly, wanting to distance herself from him. She turned to go, but he called out her name. When she turned back around, he walked forward and crossed his arms, making himself look bigger than he appeared. Tomorrow is Lizzie's birthday. We're throwing a small barbecue at my place. If you're not busy, why don't you bring Bia and yourself over? We'd love to have you, he said. She shrugged. I'll talk to Bia and see what happens. Thank you. Brandon watched her walk back inside the house, and inside, he felt his heart ache. Of all the people in the world, he wasn't expecting to see her. He came to pick up Lizzie and heard the commotion in the garage. He saw the shadow and assumed it was a thief because he knew Bia didn't have any visitors, but he didn't expect to find her there. She was as beautiful as ever, probably more now than she'd reached a mature age. She wasn't thin anymore. She'd inherited curves like a real woman should have, and he felt those curves when he was dragging her out. Worse, he liked how they felt against his hands. She'd also smelled incredible, like honey and wild daisies. It stirred his groins and made him think of things he shouldn't have been thinking about in the first place. But when it came to Stacey, he'd always thought of things he shouldn't have thought. They had been best friends, and she'd made it clear that they would always remain best friends. But to him, she'd been more than that. To him, she'd been the woman he'd wanted all his life. She'd been the one he wanted to wake up to in the morning and to sleep next to at night. But she'd never thought twice of him that way, and after high school, he'd watch as she left him to marry someone he knew would never love her enough. And he'd been right. He'd heard about her divorce, and he wanted to wring Jake's neck for hurting her. He wanted to drive up to the big city, kidnap her, and drive her back to soothe her wounds. But he knew that things had changed between them, and even if he wanted her, she wasn't the same anymore. When a woman had gone through an ordeal like her, she became distant and unloving toward another man. He wanted to make sure she was over Jake before he moved in. He didn't want to be the rebound guy that only got her body. He climbed up the steps to find Lizzie playing on the front porch of his mother's two-story house. He walked to her, and as he reached out, he heard the door open, and he turned to find his mother emerging with a tray of cookies and milk. His mother, Vera, was a simple woman with a simple mind. She wore long flowing skirts and knitted tops and had her hair always in a bun. She was a strong and pretty woman with a clear head on her shoulders. His father died when he was young, and she raised him working two jobs. He loved her more than life itself and knew that he could never repay her for her hard work. But he had done something right when he brought Lizzie to the world. Daddy! Lizzie yelled, breaking his thoughts. Hey, Pumpkin, how was your day? He asked as she jumped into his arms. She smiled and pinched his cheeks. I made Granny chase me. He groaned. I thought I told you to stop doing that. Oh, hush, Vera said as she set down the tray. It keeps me young. Come on, Lizzie, go wash your hands and have some cookies and milk. Yes, she screamed as she jumped off him and rushed inside the house. Vera sat down and picked up a cookie which she handed to him. You been over to Bia's house? Yeah. Vera smiled. So you know she's back. Brandon looked away as he chewed on the cookie. Yeah. Smiling, she said, I wonder how this will go down. The two of you were inseparable. I'm not sure why your lives turned out the way it did. Now, I love my granddaughter, but I'd also love to be able to see you have a woman around you too. So you keep telling me. I'm sorry, Mother, but a child is one thing, a woman is another. Vera laughed and she pinched his cheek. Brandon, I'm not getting any younger. I'd like to know that if something were to happen to me, you'd be taken care of, and so will Lizzie. I know that, and I understand. But after what happened, I'm not going to risk anything. The house was silent as Brandon sat in the darkened living room going through the old photos of him and Stacey. He didn't need to look through them. Honestly, her face had imprinted in his soul. It was the day he realized he loved her not as a friend, but as a woman. It was the day he realized he was jealous of her. Feeling the pain of the memories hit him, he shoved all the pictures back into the box and closed the lid. It was too long ago, and they weren't the same anymore. Back then, she wasn't divorced, and he wasn't a father. Today, they were two very different people. Lizzie. When he thought of her name, he felt his heart lurch into full protection mode. His daughter was everything to him, and the thought of someone hurting her made him queasy. He never knew he could feel that way about someone. Lizzie was everything to him at the moment, and she didn't even know how she held his heart in her hands. He rubbed his forehead and thought about how his life had ended up this way, because he'd never planned for it to begin this way at all. The truth was, Lizzie wasn't his biological daughter. Her mother, Janelle, the head cheerleader, the most wanted girl of all high school, decided to party a little bit late and drink too much. He happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. He'd pick her up and was heading toward her house to drop her off when her father, the chief of police, pulled him over and caught him with his daughter. She was knocked out cold, and he had spent a night in jail because her father decided he didn't like his story. A month later, Janelle showed up at his doorstep and announced that she was pregnant. Shocked, Brandon asked why she'd show up at his house. Before she could answer, her father drove up in a police car and threatened to arrest him if he didn't take responsibilities for his actions. It was then that he realized she told her father a lie about the two of them. No one but his mother believed him. He spent hours trying to get her to confess the truth to her father, but Janelle refused to tell him the truth. He knew that if he refused her father would take everything away from him. So he did what he thought was right and agreed. Her father wanted a big wedding in France where her extended family lived, and Janelle wanted to wait until after she delivered to have the wedding, even though her father disagreed. When Lizzie was born 9 months later, he took one look at her and fell in love. It wasn't until Lizzie turned 2 months old that Janelle decided she wasn't meant to be a mother. She left a note explaining everything to her father. The lies and the truth were all exposed and left without a single word to him. She left Lizzie in his care and wasn't heard from again. Embarrassed, her father resigned and left town, and he was left with the baby girl who would and always remain his. He leaned back in his chair and wondered when life would give him a break. Now, a woman he had never forgotten had returned back to his life. Could he live his life like he did before she came back? And could he resist her if the moment came up? He was afraid of the answer as he thought about it. As far as Stacey was concerned, Brandon always knew she was the only one who could make his heart pound like it did. But how could you reveal to someone like Stacey that you never saw her as a best friend, but as a woman of lust? I'm screwed, he whispered into the dark. Thank you for tuning in. Chapter 2 will be uploaded shortly.
Running through the crowd on a busy street, need to find some air in the summer heat. So how about the music, like a whisper from the sea?